1942, the bizarre mechanic who fixed a burning B-24 in midair. Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe and hit that like button. These historical investigations require extensive research through military archives, veteran testimonies, and declassified documents. Your support helps us continue bringing you these remarkable untold stories from World War II. Now let's explore one of the most extraordinary acts of courage ever performed at 20,000 feet. The morning of November 17, 1942, dawned cold and clear over the North African coast. At a makeshift airfield near Benghazi, Libya, crews of the 98th Bombardment Group were preparing for a mission that would take them deep into enemy territory. Their target, the harbor facilities at Tunis, Tunisia, where Axis forces were frantically unloading supplies to support their operations in North Africa. The strategic situation was critical. Allied forces were pushing west across Libya. German and Italian forces were consolidating in Tunisia, and control of the Mediterranean supply routes would determine the outcome of the entire North African campaign. Every successful bombing mission degraded the enemy's ability to sustain their forces, and every failed mission meant Allied ground troops would face better supplied opponents in the battles to come. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Among the aircraft preparing for the mission was B-24D Liberator serial number 41-23722, nicknamed the Sandman by her crew. She was a relatively new aircraft, having arrived in theater only 6 weeks earlier, but she'd already accumulated an impressive combat record with 12 missions completed. Her crew had developed the kind of trust in their aircraft that came from surviving dangerous situations together. The trust that this particular combination of aluminum, steel, and rivets would bring them home one more time. The B-24 Liberator was a workhorse of the American bombing campaign, capable of carrying heavy bomb loads over long distances, but it had quirks and vulnerabilities that crews learned to respect. It was less forgiving than the B-17 Flying Fortress, more prone to catastrophic damage when hit, but faster and able to reach targets that other bombers couldn't. Flying a Liberator required skill, attention, and a certain amount of luck. The pilot that morning was First Lieutenant Robert Bob Hayes from Topeka, Kansas, 24 years old, with the kind of calm demeanor that made him popular with crews who appreciated competence over bravado. He'd flown bombers for 18 months, accumulating combat experience over North Africa and Europe, and he understood the mathematics of survival: maintain formation, follow procedures, don't take unnecessary risks, and hope that when things inevitably went wrong, they went wrong in manageable ways rather than catastrophic ones. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant James Morrison, younger and less experienced but learning quickly in the brutal school of combat aviation where mistakes were often fatal. The navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 4 gunners rounded out the crew, 9 men total, each one essential to the mission's success and to each other's survival. But there was a 10th man aboard the Sandman that morning, someone who wasn't officially part of the flight crew, but whose presence would prove to be the difference between life and death for everyone on board. Staff Sergeant Anthony "Tony" Marconi was a flight engineer and mechanic, 32 years old, from a working-class Italian neighborhood in Philadelphia. Before the war, he'd operated a small garage, specializing in engine repair and custom modifications for the cars of wealthy clients who appreciated his uncanny ability to diagnose problems that other mechanics missed. He understood machinery the way some people understood music or mathematics, intuitively able to hear problems in the sound of an engine, to feel issues through vibrations that others couldn't detect. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Marconi had enlisted immediately, his skills making him valuable to the Army Air Forces, which needed men who could keep temperamental aircraft engines running under conditions that would destroy civilian machinery. Normally, flight engineers didn't fly combat missions. They worked on the ground, maintaining aircraft, performing repairs, ensuring that planes were airworthy before takeoff. But Marconi had been growing increasingly frustrated with a persistent problem affecting the Sandman's No. 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing. The engine ran rough at certain altitudes and power settings, occasionally backfiring, showing temperature fluctuations that suggested fuel mixture issues or possibly problems with the ignition system. Ground tests couldn't replicate the problem consistently, which meant Marconi couldn't definitively identify the cause. The engine would run smoothly on the ground, pass all inspections, then develop issues at altitude under combat conditions. It was the kind of intermittent problem that drove mechanics crazy, because you couldn't fix what you couldn't reliably observe. So Marconi had approached Lieutenant Hayes with an unusual request. let him fly the mission as an observer, positioned where he could monitor the engine's performance under actual combat conditions, gathering information that might help him diagnose and fix the problem permanently. Hayes had been skeptical. Taking a non-essential crew member on a combat mission increased risk without adding capability, and if the aircraft was damaged, that was one more person to worry about. But Marconi had been persistent, arguing that fixing the engine problem might prevent a future catastrophic failure that could cost the entire crew their lives. Eventually, Hayes had agreed, clearing it with the squadron commander and making room for Marconi in the aircraft's waist section, where he could access the engine nacelle through an inspection panel if needed. The mission briefing had been straightforward. 24 B-24s would form up and fly across the Mediterranean to Tunis, approximately 650 miles from their base. Fighter escort would accompany them for the first 200 miles, but would have to turn back due to fuel limitations, leaving the bombers to face enemy fighters alone for the remainder of the mission. Intelligence estimated moderate to heavy anti-aircraft defenses around the target, with possible fighter opposition from both German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Italian Machi C-202s. Weather was expected to be clear, good for navigation and bombing accuracy, but also good for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft gunners who would have excellent visibility. The plan called for bombing from 20,000 feet, high enough to make anti-aircraft fire less accurate but low enough to maintain reasonable bombing precision. Each aircraft would carry a standard load of 5,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary ordnance, targeting the dock facilities, warehouses, and fuel storage areas that supplied Axis forces in Tunisia. Takeoff proceeded smoothly. The Sandman lifted off the rough desert airstrip at 07:45 hours, forming up with her squadron as the larger formation assembled. The climb to operational altitude took 40 minutes. The 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines, each producing 200 horsepower, pulling the heavily loaded bomber skyward at a steady rate. Marconi, positioned in the waist section with access to his tools and the inspection panels, monitored the engine's sound and vibration, making notes on a pad he'd brought for precisely this purpose. The number 3 engine was running smoothly during the climb, showing no signs of the roughness that had plagued previous missions. Maybe the problem had been fixed by the latest round of maintenance, or maybe it only manifested under specific conditions they hadn't yet encountered. The formation crossed the Mediterranean, the deep blue water stretching endlessly below them, the fighter escort wheeling and circling overhead like protective hawks. Radio chatter was minimal. Crews maintained radio silence except for essential communications, knowing that German listening posts monitored all frequencies and that loose talk could alert enemy forces to their approach. The temperature at 20,000 feet was well below freezing, and despite their heavy flight suits and the aircraft's inadequate heating, crews shivered in the thin air. Oxygen masks were necessary at this altitude. The air was too thin to sustain consciousness without supplemental oxygen, and the masks added another layer of discomfort to an already miserable experience. At the 200-mile mark, the fighter escort waggled their wings in farewell and turned back toward base, their fuel reserves requiring them to leave before the bombers reached the most dangerous phase of the mission. Now the B-24s were alone, 24 aircraft in a defensive formation designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire from their turrets and waist guns, presenting any attacking fighters with a wall of 50 caliber machine gun fire that made close approaches suicidal. But formations could be broken up, stragglers could be isolated, and damaged aircraft became easy prey. Every crew member understood that survival depended on staying in formation, maintaining position, covering each other. They crossed the Tunisian coast at 10:35 hours, and immediately the character of the mission changed. The peaceful monotony of flying over water gave way to the tension of flying over enemy-held territory, where every city, every airfield, every anti-aircraft battery was a potential threat. Navigator Lieutenant Charles Weber called out checkpoints, keeping them on course toward the target. Bombardier Lieutenant Paul Richardson prepared his equipment, checking the Norden bomb site that would, in theory, allow precision bombing from high altitude. The gunners swiveled their weapons, scanning the sky for the first sign of enemy fighters that intelligence had promised would appear. And then, at 10:47 hours, approximately 15 minutes from the target, the number 3 engine on the Sandman exploded. The mechanical failure was catastrophic and instantaneous. One moment the engine was running normally, producing steady power, contributing its share to keeping the heavy bomber aloft. The next moment, something inside the engine, a connecting rod, a piston, some critical component stressed beyond its design limits, failed violently. Metal tore through metal, or the engine literally destroyed itself from the inside, pieces of the crankcase blowing outward, oil spraying in dark clouds, fuel lines rupturing, and most critically, sparks and hot metal fragments igniting the fuel and oil mixture that suddenly filled the engine nacelle. Fire erupted, orange flames streaming from the cowling, fed by aviation gasoline and pressurized by the 200-mile-per-hour airstream that rushed past the wing. On the flight deck, warning lights illuminated and alarms sounded. Hayes felt the immediate asymmetric thrust as the No. 3 engine not only stopped producing power, but began creating massive drag. The aircraft wanted to yaw violently to the right, requiring full left rudder just to maintain heading. Morrison was already reaching for the engine controls, shutting off fuel to the damaged engine, activating the fire suppression system, a carbon dioxide system designed to smother engine fires by displacing oxygen. But the fire continued, fed by fuel that was leaking from ruptured lines before the shutoff valves, burning with an intensity that the suppression system couldn't overcome. Through the cockpit window, Hayes could see the flames, could see pieces of the engine cowling beginning to peel away from the heat, could see the aluminum wing skin starting to discolor from the temperatures that were building in the nacelle. Every pilot knew the procedure for engine fires: shut off fuel, activate suppression, and if the fire didn't extinguish within 30 seconds, prepare to abandon aircraft. Engine fires on bombers were often fatal. They could spread to fuel tanks in the wings, could weaken wing structure until it failed catastrophically, could create explosions that destroyed the aircraft in seconds. The procedure existed because experience had proven that trying to fight an uncontrollable fire usually meant the entire crew perished, instead of just accepting the loss of the aircraft and saving the lives through timely bailout. Hayes made the hardest decision a pilot ever faces. "Prepare to abandon aircraft," he ordered over the intercom, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "This is not a drill. Fire in No. 3 engine. Suppression ineffective. Bombardier, navigator, radio operator. Prepare the forward escape hatch. Gunners, prepare the waist hatches. We'll hold steady for 2 more minutes to give everyone time to get to their positions. Then I'm giving the order to bail out. Acknowledge." One by one, the crew acknowledged, their voices tight with controlled terror. They'd trained for this, practiced the procedures, knew where their parachutes were stowed, knew which hatches to use for emergency exit. But training and reality were different things, and jumping from an aircraft at 20,000 feet into enemy territory meant trading one set of dangers for another. They'd be parachuting into Tunisia, where German and Italian forces controlled the ground, where capture was likely and survival uncertain. But staying with a burning aircraft meant certain death, so the choice was clear even if it wasn't pleasant. In the waist section, Marconi had watched the No. 3 engine destroy itself, had seen the fire erupt, had understood immediately that the aircraft was in mortal danger. He heard Hayes's order to prepare to abandon aircraft, heard the acknowledgments from the other crew members, knew that in approximately 2 minutes he'd be jumping from this aircraft with a parachute, hoping it opened properly, hoping he survived the landing, hoping he could evade capture long enough to reach Allied lines. But as he watched the fire consuming the engine, as he processed what he was seeing with the trained eye of a mechanic who'd spent 15 years understanding machinery, something occurred to him that changed everything. The fire was burning in a specific pattern. It wasn't a general conflagration consuming the entire engine nacelle. It was concentrated around the fuel lines, fed by the pressurized fuel that continued to spray from ruptured lines despite the fuel shutoff valve being closed, which meant the shutoff valve wasn't actually shutting off fuel completely, probably because the valve itself had been damaged in the initial explosion, or because debris was preventing it from closing fully. But if someone could physically access the fuel line between the tank and the engine, could manually close off the fuel flow by some means, clamping the line, crimping it, cutting it, the fire would lose its fuel source and would likely extinguish, leaving only the oil already in the nacelle to burn out. Without fresh fuel feeding it, the fire would be manageable, possibly survivable. The problem was access. The fuel lines ran through the wing structure, deep inside the aircraft, accessible only through maintenance panels that required tools to open and access points that were never designed to be reached in flight. In a maintenance hangar, with the aircraft on the ground and proper equipment, a mechanic could trace the fuel system, identify the damaged valve, and repair or bypass it in perhaps 2 hours of careful work. In flight, at 20,000 feet, with the aircraft shaking from turbulence and asymmetric thrust, with limited oxygen, with the clock ticking toward the moment when the fire weakened wing structure enough to cause catastrophic failure, It was effectively impossible. But Marconi had spent his entire adult life doing things with engines that other people considered impossible. He'd rebuilt transmissions while lying under cars in winter with frozen fingers. He'd diagnosed electrical problems that dealership mechanics had given up on. He'd kept ancient engines running through combinations of improvisation, stubbornness, and an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems worked that couldn't be taught from textbooks. And now, looking at the burning engine through the small window in the waste section, he could visualize the fuel system layout, could trace in his mind where the lines ran, could identify a possible access point where he might be able to reach the fuel line and stop the flow manually. He grabbed his tool bag, the heavy canvas satchel he'd insisted on bringing despite the weight, filled with wrenches, pliers, cutting tools, and other equipment that now might be the difference between life and death. Then he moved forward through the aircraft, climbing over the bomb bay catwalk, squeezing past equipment and crew members who were preparing to bail out, heading toward the cockpit, where he needed to tell Hayes what he intended to try. The flight deck was cramped with both pilots fighting the controls, trying to keep the aircraft stable enough for the crew to bail out safely. Hayes saw Marconi climbing into the cockpit area and shouted over the engine noise, "Get to the escape hatch. We're abandoning in 60 seconds." Marconi shook his head. "Lieutenant, I think I can stop the fire. The fuel shutoff valve isn't closing completely. If I can access the fuel line and manually shut off the flow, the fire will burn out. Give me 5 minutes before you give the bailout order." Hayes stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "That's impossible. The fuel lines are inside the wing structure. You can't access them in flight. There's an inspection panel in the wing root, inside the fuselage. It's designed for checking the fuel system connections between the fuselage tanks and the wing tanks. If I can open that panel, I can reach the fuel line before it enters the wing. I can cut it, crimp it, something to stop the fuel flow." Morrison, still fighting with the controls, said what Hayes was thinking. "That panel is 40 inches off the deck in a space barely 2 feet wide, with metal edges that'll tear you apart if we hit turbulence. Even if you reach the fuel line, you'll be working with aviation fuel under pressure, with a fire burning 50 feet away. If you make a mistake, if fuel sprays on you and ignites, you'll burn to death. It's suicide. We're all going to die if we don't stop that fire," Marconi shot back. "Either it spreads and destroys the aircraft before everyone bails out, or we bail out and maybe survive the parachute jump, but definitely face capture in enemy territory. But if I can stop the fire, we can make it home, all of us. No one has to die or become a prisoner. Just give me 5 minutes to try." Hayes looked at his co-pilot, saw his own conflict reflected there, then made a decision that violated every regulation about aircraft commanders' responsibility to preserve crew life. 5 minutes, he said. "But if that fire isn't out or significantly reduced in 5 minutes, we're abandoning regardless, understood?" "Understood." Marconi was already moving, crawling back through the aircraft toward the wing root access point that might, if he was right about its location, if he could actually reach it, if he didn't make a fatal mistake in the attempt, give him access to save them all. The inspection panel was exactly where he remembered from the technical manuals he'd studied obsessively during his months maintaining B-24s. It was a rectangular panel, 18 inches by 24 inches, secured with 12 screws and designed to be opened only on the ground with proper lighting and tools. The location was terrible, positioned where the wing joined the fuselage, in a space crowded with electrical conduits, control cables, and structural members, barely accessible even under ideal conditions. The panel itself was unpainted aluminum, marked with stenciled warnings about the high-pressure fuel systems it provided access to, warnings that emphasized the danger of opening the panel during flight operations. Marconi ignored the warnings. He pulled a screwdriver from his tool bag and started removing screws, working as fast as his cold-numbed fingers allowed, dropping the screws into his pocket because losing them in the aircraft could cause control problems if they jammed moving parts. The aircraft shook constantly from turbulence and the asymmetric thrust of having one engine shut down, making his task exponentially harder, like trying to perform surgery during an earthquake. Each screw required multiple attempts to properly align the screwdriver, and twice the tool slipped, gouging his knuckles against the sharp metal edges that surrounded the panel. After what felt like an eternity but was actually 90 seconds, he had all 12 screws removed. The panel was stuck. Years of temperature cycling had caused the aluminum to slightly weld to the frame, and it took 3 sharp blows with the heel of his hand before the panel suddenly popped free, revealing the nightmare of plumbing, wiring, and mechanical components behind it. His headlamp, a small electric light strapped to his head, normally used for working in dark engine nacelles, illuminated the cramped space, showing him what he was facing. The fuel line was there, exactly where the technical manual said it would be. A steel-braided flexible hose about an inch in diameter, running from the fuselage fuel tank forward toward the wing, where it would split to feed the engines. The line was pressurized. He could see it slightly pulsing with the pressure of the fuel being pushed through the system by the aircraft's fuel pumps. Somewhere downstream, past the shutoff valve that wasn't closing properly, that pressurized fuel was spraying into the burning engine nacelle, feeding the fire that was consuming their aircraft. His job was to stop that flow. The problem was access. The fuel line was 18 inches deep in the access space, surrounded by other components, positioned where reaching it would require him to snake his arm through a gap, barely wide enough to accommodate his limb, working blind because he couldn't get his head into the space far enough to see what he was doing, relying entirely on touch and mechanical intuition, and he needed to do this while the aircraft shook and bounced, while his hands were going numb from cold, while the clock counted down toward Hayes's deadline for abandoning the aircraft. Marconi pulled a pair of heavy-duty metal-cutting shears from his tool bag, the kind used for cutting sheet metal during aircraft repairs, with long handles that provided leverage for cutting through tough materials. His plan was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Cut through the fuel line, allowing the pressurized fuel to spray briefly into the access space where it would drain harmlessly into the bilge, then immediately after cutting the line, use a vice grip wrench to crimp the cut end shut, stopping any further fuel flow. The timing would be critical. If he cut the line but couldn't crimp it shut quickly, fuel would continue spraying, possibly igniting from static electricity or hot components, turning the interior of the aircraft into an inferno that would kill everyone before they could react. He rehearsed the sequence in his mind 3 times, visualizing each movement, planning where his hands needed to be, how he'd transition from cutting shears to vice grip, how he'd position himself to reach the line and make the cuts. Then, satisfied that he'd planned as well as possible, he reached into the access space with the shears, his arm scraping against sharp metal edges, his shoulder pressed painfully against the panel frame, his face pressed against the cold aluminum fuselage skin as he stretched to reach the fuel line. He couldn't see what he was doing. His arm was buried in the access space up to the shoulder, his hand holding the shears somewhere near the fuel line but unable to see whether the cutting edges were properly positioned. He had to work by feel, manipulating the shears until he felt them contact the braided metal surface of the fuel line, positioning them around the circumference of the hose, trying to align them properly for a clean cut. The aircraft bounced through turbulence, nearly causing him to drop the shears, and he had to withdraw his arm, reposition, try again. Each attempt took precious seconds, and his 5 minutes were rapidly expiring. On the flight deck, Hayes was watching the clock. 3 minutes had passed since Marconi had started working. The fire was still burning, perhaps slightly less intense but not significantly reduced. Morrison was monitoring the wing surface temperature, watching for the heat discoloration that would indicate structural failure was imminent. The bombardier had opened the forward escape hatch, and wind roared through the aircraft, making communication difficult and adding another source of turbulence that made control even harder. The formation had continued toward the target without them. The Sandman had fallen behind, unable to maintain speed with one engine out, becoming a straggler that would be prime target for any enemy fighters that appeared. They were alone now, 15 minutes from the target, burning, falling behind, with seconds remaining before Hayes would have no choice but to order everyone to jump. 4 minutes. Marconi had the shears positioned correctly now. He was sure of it, could feel the braided surface of the fuel line between the cutting edges, had the tool aligned perpendicular to the line's axis for a clean cut. His right hand gripped the shears handles, ready to squeeze with all his strength. His left hand held the vice grip wrench, ready to immediately clamp onto the severed line and crimp it shut. He was as prepared as possible. It was time. He squeezed the shear handles with everything he had, feeling resistance as the cutting edges bit into the braided metal sheath of the fuel line, feeling the tool slip slightly before catching again, using his shoulder and body weight for leverage because he couldn't get proper positioning for his arms in the cramped space. The aircraft hit turbulence at exactly the wrong moment, throwing him against the access frame, causing the shears to shift, but he held on, maintained pressure, felt the cutting edges sink deeper into the line. More pressure. The muscles in his forearm were burning from the awkward angle and the sustained force. The shears bit deeper, and then suddenly the resistance gave way. The fuel line parted with a metallic snap he felt more than heard. Immediately, Pressurized aviation fuel began spraying from the severed line, hitting his arm, splashing into the access space, the distinctive sharp odor filling the aircraft. He had perhaps 3 seconds before enough fuel accumulated to create a catastrophic fire hazard. 3 seconds to get the vice grip positioned on the severed line and clamped shut. 3 seconds that felt like both an eternity and no time at all. His left hand moved with practiced precision born of 15 years of mechanical work, the vice grip's jaws finding the severed fuel line through feel alone because he still couldn't see what he was doing, positioning the jaws around the cut end, squeezing the handles to lock the jaws closed, the serrated teeth of the vice grip biting into the braided line, crimping it, deforming the metal, closing off the opening through which pressurized fuel had been spraying. The fuel spray diminished, reduced to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The fuel line was sealed. Marconi withdrew his arm from the access space, his flight suit soaked with aviation fuel, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exertion, and crawled forward to the flight deck where Hayes and Morrison were still fighting to control the aircraft. "Fuel line is cut and crimped," he gasped. "No more fuel reaching the engine. Give it 30 seconds for the fire to burn out what's already in the nacelle." Hayes didn't respond, focused entirely on keeping the aircraft level and maintaining altitude with asymmetric thrust. Morrison was watching the number 3 engine through the cockpit window, counting seconds, watching for any change in the fire's intensity. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then, miraculously, impossibly, the flames began to diminish. Without fresh fuel feeding them, the fire was consuming the last of the oil and fuel already present in the nacelle, burning through the available combustibles, starved of the pressurized fuel that had been sustaining it. The orange flames faded to yellow, then to isolated patches of blue, then to nothing but smoke trailing from the damaged engine. The fire was out. Morrison's voice, filled with disbelief and relief, came over the intercom. "Fire is out. Number 3 engine fire is extinguished." The other crew members, who'd been positioned at their escape hatches waiting for the order to jump, responded with shouts of relief and amazement. They'd been seconds from bailing out, seconds from abandoning the aircraft, and now suddenly they weren't. They were damaged, flying on 3 engines, but they were alive, and the aircraft was controllable. Hayes's voice was steady, professional, but with an undercurrent of emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Outstanding work, Sergeant. Close that forward escape hatch. Secure all positions. We're continuing with the mission. Navigator, give me a heading to the target. We're not leaving this formation without dropping our bombs." Some pilots might have turned back, might have used the engine fire as justification for aborting the mission and heading home early. But Hayes had volunteered for this mission, understanding that every bomb they didn't drop on that target meant supplies would reach enemy forces, meant Allied ground troops would face better-equipped opponents, meant the war would last longer, and more people would die. They'd come to bomb a target, and as long as the aircraft could fly, they were going to complete the mission. The next 25 minutes were among the most stressful of any crew's experience in combat. Flying on 3 engines, unable to maintain formation position, damaged and trailing smoke, they were a perfect target for enemy fighters. But the German and Italian fighters were focused on the main formation, and the Sandman, alone, struggling, clearly damaged, was apparently judged not worth the ammunition. They reached the target area just as the main formation was beginning its bomb run, managed to align themselves with the target despite the difficulty of maintaining heading with asymmetric thrust, and when Bombardier Richardson called "bombs away," felt the aircraft leap upward as 5,000 pounds of ordnance dropped free and began their fall toward the harbor facilities below. The flight back to base was an exercise in careful aircraft management. Hayes and Morrison had to constantly adjust power and trim to compensate for the dead engine, maintaining altitude and airspeed through careful coordination. The number 3 engine, though no longer on fire, was a drag-producing liability, its windmilling propeller creating resistance that reduced their speed and increased fuel consumption. Fuel became a critical concern. The extra consumption from the asymmetric flight meant they might not have enough to reach base, forcing them to consider alternative landing sites or even ditching in the Mediterranean. But Marconi, his job fixing the burning engine complete, turned his attention to fuel management, calculating consumption rates, recommending power settings that optimized their range, helping them squeeze every possible mile from their remaining fuel. They crossed the Tunisian coast outbound at 12:40 hours, and for the first time since the engine failure, Hayes allowed himself to believe they might actually make it home. The formation had long since left them behind, arriving back at base an hour before the Sandman would. The Mediterranean stretched below them, peaceful and blue, hiding the depths where so many aircraft and crews had vanished when damage or fuel exhaustion forced them down short of safety. At 14:20 hours, they crossed the Libyan coast with fuel gauges showing practically empty. At 14:35 hours, they spotted the airfield, that precious strip of cleared desert that meant survival. Hayes called the tower, reported his situation, 3 engines, structural fire damage, low fuel, and received priority clearance to land immediately. He lined up on final approach, managing the asymmetric thrust carefully, maintaining just enough speed to stay airborne but not so much that he couldn't stop on the relatively short desert runway. The landing was rough. The damaged aircraft didn't respond quite right to control inputs, but they were down, they were stopped, and when Hayes shut down the remaining 3 engines, the sudden silence was perhaps the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, assessing the damage, providing assistance to crew members who stumbled out on shaky legs. The number 3 engine was completely destroyed, the nacelle blackened and partially melted, pieces of cowling missing or hanging at odd angles. The wing showed heat damage extending several feet from the engine mount, and engineers would later determine that the wing structure had been perhaps 5 minutes from catastrophic failure when the fire was extinguished. If Marconi had been unable to stop the fuel flow, if the fire had continued burning, the wing would have failed and the aircraft would have disintegrated, killing everyone aboard. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Richard Anderson was waiting when Hayes climbed down from the aircraft. "Report, Lieutenant. What happened up there?" Hayes, exhausted and still processing the experience, gave a concise summary. Catastrophic engine failure. Fire. Attempted to suppress using standard procedures. Fire continued. Prepared to abandon aircraft. Sergeant Marconi volunteered to attempt manual fuel shutoff. Succeeded despite impossible conditions. Fire extinguished. Continued mission. Return to base on 3 engines. The colonel listened without interruption, his expression becoming increasingly incredulous, then called Marconi over. "Sergeant, Lieutenant Hayes tells me you crawled into the wing structure of a burning aircraft in flight and manually cut a pressurized fuel line to stop an engine fire. Is that accurate?" Marconi, still smelling of aviation fuel, his hands cut and bruised, nodded. "Yes, sir. The fire suppression system wasn't working because the fuel shutoff valve was damaged. I accessed the fuel line through an inspection panel and cut it upstream of the damaged valve, then crimped it shut with a vice grip. Standard procedure for isolating a leaking fuel line, just not usually done in flight." "Standard procedure?" the colonel repeated, his tone suggesting he found nothing standard about any of it. "Sergeant, you understand that what you did was extraordinarily dangerous? That you were working with pressurized aviation fuel in an enclosed space with a fire burning nearby? That if you'd made even a small mistake, you'd have been killed instantly and possibly destroyed the aircraft and everyone on it?" "Yes, sir. I understood the risks, but the alternative was definitely losing the aircraft and probably losing the crew. The risk seemed justified." Anderson studied him for a long moment, then looked at Hayes. "Lieutenant, I'm putting both you and Sergeant Marconi in for commendations. This is one of the most remarkable pieces of airmanship and technical skill I've encountered. You made a difficult command decision, and Sergeant Marconi executed an action that I'm not sure I've ever heard of being attempted, much less succeeded. Your crew is alive because of good judgment and extraordinary courage." The commendations came through 3 weeks later. Hayes received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his command decisions under emergency conditions. Marconi received the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest decorations for valor, citation reading in part, "for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy." Staff Sergeant Marconi, with complete disregard for his personal safety, volunteered to attempt repairs on a burning aircraft engine while in flight under combat conditions. Through extraordinary technical skill and courage, he successfully extinguished a catastrophic fire that would have resulted in the loss of the aircraft and crew. His actions reflect the highest traditions of military service, but the real story spread through the unofficial channels that mattered more to the men who flew and maintained the bombers, the ground crews, the flight engineers, the mechanics who kept the aircraft flying despite impossible conditions and inadequate resources. The story of Tony Marconi, the mechanic who fixed a burning B-24 in midair, became legendary. It was told in maintenance shops, repeated during training sessions, invoked whenever someone said something was impossible to fix. The details evolved slightly with each retelling, but the core remained. When everyone else was preparing to abandon the aircraft, one man with tools and knowledge and courage had done something that defied conventional wisdom and saved 9 lives. Marconi himself remained characteristically modest about the entire affair. When other mechanics asked him about it, he'd shrug and say something like, "I just did what needed to be done. The fuel line needed to be shut off. I had the tools to do it, so I did it. Any of you would have done the same." But that wasn't quite true. Not everyone would have had the technical knowledge to diagnose the problem correctly under pressure. Not everyone would have had the courage to attempt a repair that could easily have killed them. Not everyone would have had the mechanical skill to execute the repair successfully in such impossible conditions. The Sandman flew again. After extensive repairs that took 3 weeks and required replacing the entire No. 3 engine, rebuilding sections of the wing structure, and repairing various other damage from the fire and the strain of flying on 3 engines. The repairs were overseen by Marconi, who refused to sign off on the aircraft's return to service until he was personally satisfied that every system was functioning properly. When she returned to operations, her crew requested that Marconi's name be added to the aircraft's nose art, painting Marconi's Miracle beneath the original Sandman nickname, a permanent tribute to the man who'd saved their lives. The aircraft completed 37 more combat missions before the end of the war, surviving to be returned to the United States and eventually scrapped in 1945 when the military reduced its massive wartime aircraft inventory. But photographs of her nose art, showing both nicknames and the artwork celebrating her crew's experiences, were preserved in squadron records and eventually in historical archives, ensuring that the story of that November day in 1942 wouldn't be entirely forgotten. Marconi survived the war, returning to Philadelphia in 1945 to reopen his garage. He never spoke about his military service unless directly asked, preferring to focus on the present rather than dwelling on the past. But former crew members stayed in touch with him, visited when they could, and at reunions of the 98th Bombardment Group, Marconi was always treated with special respect by men who understood that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. When he died in 1989 at age 79, his funeral was attended by 3 surviving members of the Sandman's crew, elderly men who'd traveled from across the country to pay their respects to the man who'd given them their futures. The broader lesson of Marconi's action wasn't about the specific technical details of cutting fuel lines or fighting engine fires. Those were unique circumstances unlikely to be precisely replicated. The lesson was about the value of technical expertise, the importance of understanding the systems you work with deeply enough to innovate solutions when standard procedures fail, and the courage to act decisively when the stakes are highest. Modern military training incorporates these principles, emphasizing that technical specialists need not just procedural knowledge, but deep understanding that allows creative problem-solving under pressure. The story also highlights the often overlooked contribution of ground crews and support personnel to combat operations. Historians and popular culture tend to focus on pilots, on the dramatic aerial combat and bombing missions, sometimes forgetting that those missions were possible only because thousands of mechanics, engineers, armorers, and other support personnel kept the aircraft flying. Every successful mission represented not just the skill of the flight crew, but the expertise of the ground personnel who'd maintained that aircraft, fixed its problems, ensured it was airworthy despite the harsh conditions and limited resources of wartime operations. In 2015, the Air Force Historical Foundation published a comprehensive study of unusual technical repairs performed under combat conditions during World War II. Marconi's mid-air repair of the Sandman's fuel system was featured prominently, analyzed from engineering and procedural perspectives, and cited as an example of how technical knowledge, improvisation, and courage could combine to overcome situations that doctrine and procedure deemed unsurvivable. The study noted that while the specific circumstances were unique, the underlying principle, that well-trained technical personnel with appropriate tools and knowledge can often find solutions to problems that appear insurmountable, remains relevant to modern military operations. The bizarre mechanic who fixed a burning B-24 in midair represents something important about human capability under pressure. When faced with impossible situations, some individuals find ways to make the impossible possible, not through superhuman strength or magical intervention, but through expertise, courage, and the willingness to attempt solutions that others might consider too risky or too difficult. Tony Marconi didn't have special powers. He had knowledge gained through years of working with engines, courage developed through facing difficult situations, and the moral conviction that saving his comrades' lives was worth personal risk. Those are qualities that can be developed, trained, cultivated, which means the heroism he displayed, while extraordinary, wasn't entirely beyond the reach of others who might find themselves in similar circumstances. That's perhaps the most important legacy of the story. It's not just a tale of one remarkable action on one dangerous day in 1942. It's a reminder that ordinary people, armed with knowledge and courage, can accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demands it. The mechanic who fixed a burning bomber in flight wasn't born a hero. He became one through the accumulation of skills, experiences, and choices that prepared him for the moment when heroism was required. And that's a lesson worth remembering, preserving, and passing on to future generations who will face their own impossible situations and need to find their own courage to overcome them. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of World War II's most remarkable acts of technical courage. The story of Tony Marconi and the Sandman reminds us that heroism takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important contributions come from people whose names never make the headlines but whose actions change everything for those around them. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more content exploring the forgotten heroes and remarkable events of military history. Share this video to help ensure that people like Tony Marconi, who did extraordinary things without seeking recognition, are remembered and honored. What other untold stories of technical innovation and courage from World War II should we investigate? Let us know in the comments. And remember, expertise, courage, and quick thinking can overcome situations that seem impossible. That's not just history, it's a lesson for any challenge we might face.